Phillips. He was one of these people who, everybody knew him, everybody liked him.
Mr. Matthews was not breathing. It was obvious that his wounds were incompatible with life.
Once you resort to murder, then there's nothing you wouldn't do to get what you want.
In April 1998, a 29-year-old man named Toby Matthews was shot and killed on a rural road outside Corsicana, Texas. He had been sent on an errand to pick up cold medicine for a sick child. He did not come home. 7 shell casings were found on West Park Road beside his car. The door was open. The engine was still running. This was not a random crime. The danger came from someone he loved, someone who lived under his roof and asked him to make that drive. What followed was one of the most calculated betrayals you will ever hear. The law almost let it go, but a confession, overheard in a jail cell by a complete stranger, changed everything. Over the next few minutes, we will follow exactly how this unraveled, and the one secret Cynthia Phillips never meant to share. Stay with me. This story begins in Corsicana, Texas, and with a man who moved there for one reason, and one reason only. The radio crackles at 11:22 p.m. Shots fired in the vicinity of West Park Road. Officer Dustin Munn is patrolling the rural edges of Corsicana, Texas, when the call comes through. He rolls toward it without urgency. West Park Road sits at the fringe of town, the kind of quiet stretch where these calls come in every few weeks, usually meaning a coyote in the brush or a possum that wandered onto someone's property. Munn has answered calls like this before. They end with a shrug and a report nobody reads. This is April 1998, a Tuesday night, and it is quiet in Corsicana. He is not expecting anything. I certainly did not expect to find what I found. He follows his headlights along West Park Road and sees the car before he sees anything else. A vehicle is sitting in the middle of the lane, not pulled to the shoulder, not parked with any purpose, engine running, headlights burning into the dark ahead. The driver's door is slightly ajar. Munn stops and steps out. He moves toward the vehicle, one hand free, scanning the darkness on either side of the road. Everything is quiet except the engine. The vehicle was running, he would later say. The headlights were on. The door was slightly open. He circles the car. Nobody inside. No sign of a struggle near the driver's door. The scene has an unnatural patience to it, a car idling, waiting, as though the driver simply stepped away. No skid marks, no sound except the engine ticking over. Everything wrong, and nothing visibly broken. That is the kind of scene that means something deliberate happened here. Munn moves to the rear of the vehicle. That's where I saw the body laying. A man is on the asphalt behind the car, face up, motionless. A name tag on his chest catches the beam of the flashlight, the small, rectangular kind worn on a work uniform. It reads, Toby Matthews. He is 29 years old, and he is not moving. The engine was still running. Nobody lies down behind their own car at midnight on a country road. Munn does not need to check for a pulse. It was obvious, he would say, that his wounds were incompatible with life. The wounds are not from a fall. They are multiple, close, deliberate. 7 shell casings are scattered across the asphalt near the body. Not the random spread of panic, not a single shot from a robbery cut short. 7. Someone stood over Toby Matthews and kept firing until they were certain he was not getting up. That is not panic. That is intent. The car keeps idling. The headlights cut into an empty road in both directions. Boy Matthews is on the ground behind his own vehicle, and the engine waits for a driver who will never get back in. Someone sent him out here tonight. Nothing on this road is going to say who. His name was Toby Matthews, and until a few hours earlier, he had been planning a wedding. He grew up in Lamar, a small town in Prowers County, Colorado, and he stayed when most of his friends moved on. He was not the kind of man who needed to leave to prove something. He was steady, warm, exactly what he seemed. He found his place behind the bar at Opal's, where everybody knew him and everybody liked him. He was one of these people who, everybody knew him, everybody liked him, a friend would later say. In 1994, Cynthia Phillips walked into Opal's. She was 29, curly blonde hair, long fingernails, the kind of woman who stood out in any room she entered. Toby noticed. Most men did. What Toby did not know, or chose not to weigh too heavily, was that Cynthia already had husband. Ron Phillips was back in Colorado, a marriage still technically ongoing, when she and Toby began to find their way toward each other. She left Ron eventually. She left Colorado too, and when she went to Corsicana, Texas, Toby went with her. He took a job at the Kmart there. He learned the streets of a Texas town he had no reason to know before Cynthia. And he stepped into a ready-made family. She had 2 daughters, young girls who needed someone steady in the house. Nobody asked Toby to become that person. He just did. It was a great dad. You know, the girls did anything that they needed. They got, a friend later said. He never asked why it took her so long to leave Ron. He just took the girls in as though they had always been his. By the fall of 1997, someone else had moved into the household. A man named Rick Boyd, a friend of Cynthia's father, who worked as an exterminator, had come to stay. He said to help split expenses. Toby accepted that too. By early 1998, he and Cynthia were talking about marriage. He had a plan, this town, this woman, these girls. The future looked like something he was building toward. On the night of April 14, one of the daughters was sick. Nothing serious, just a cold. He was headed to the Kmart to pick up some cold medicine for Cynthia's daughter. A few minutes there, a few minutes back. An ordinary errand on an ordinary night. Toby drove toward the Kmart. He did not come back. He had never asked too many questions about the man sharing the house, or about where Cynthia had come from, or about what she had left behind. He was the kind of man who took people at their word. That was not a flaw, it was just who he was. West Park Road was not on the way to anything he feared. He had no reason to be afraid. 7 9mm shell casings on the asphalt, a car still running, a dead man with no explanation the scene was willing to offer. The first question investigators ask at a scene like this is the simplest one. What was taken? Robbery accounts for most roadside shootings. A man stops. Someone approaches, and afterward the wallet is gone. That is the shape of it, usually. Not here. The victim still retained his identification. Money that he had on him, there were no signs of anything being taken. Everything in his pockets was where it should be. Cash, ID, untouched. Robbery was eliminated before the hour was out. The second question followed naturally. Was there a drug connection? A car stopped in the middle of a rural road at night, far from any address. Suggests an exchange, a meeting that was never meant to be witnessed. Investigators looked for priors, for known associations, for any thread that might connect Toby to that world. There was nothing to find. We had no information at all that our victim had anything to do with narcotics in any way. The scene that looked like a deal had no deal behind it, which left the road itself as the only puzzle. Why here? Why this location, with nothing to explain a stop? What was left was stranger. The car door was open. The body was behind the vehicle. No signs of a struggle inside the car. No drag marks, no evidence of force. He had walked back there on his own. He got out of the car willingly. Whatever he expected from that stop, it was not 7 bullets. It seemed reasonable that he was stopping for someone that he knew. That was the working conclusion. Whoever was waiting on West Park Road that night, Toby had not been afraid of them. He stepped out into the dark to meet them. That kind of trust doesn't happen with a stranger. It happens when you already know whose headlights those are. The engine ran on. The headlights pushed into empty road. The 7 casings lay where they had fallen, and the scene had no more to offer. No motive, no witness. A cold April night with nothing moving, just the engine, and a question without a shape. Then, from down the road, headlights appeared. A vehicle slowed and stopped. A man got out. He walked toward the lights of the patrol car and asked if the person who had been driving that car was all right. Nobody had called him. Nobody had told him to come. He had simply appeared at an active crime scene in the middle of the night with no invitation. The investigators turned toward him. They watched him cross the road. He was going to say his name. Whatever came next would depend on whether that name meant anything, and on whether the way he said it matched the way a man looks when he has just learned someone he cares about might be dead. The man stepped into the light and said his name was Rick Boyd. He wanted to know if Toby was all right. Munn looked at him. Nobody had called Rick Boyd. Nobody had sent him here. And yet here he was, at an active homicide scene, in the middle of the night, asking the right question about the right man. Munn told him Toby Matthews was dead. Boyd received that information. He stood there, against the backdrop of the scene lights, and he received it. No collapse, no sound. His face held the news the way a wall holds a photograph without changing shape. Investigators watched him. He said he had come looking for Toby, that he had been worried when Toby did not return, that he had driven out here because something felt wrong. The affect was noted. Boyd's stillness was not the stillness of shock. Shock makes a person go somewhere forward, backward, to the ground. Boyd stayed exactly where he was. He had a connection to both Toby and to Cynthia Phillips. He had shown up uninvited, and he had not looked like a man who just learned his friend was dead. That was a thread. Investigators pulled it. While Boyd was processed at the scene, another team drove to Cynthia's address in Corsicana. It was early morning by then. When the door opened, the difference was immediate. Cynthia's voice broke at the threshold. Her daughters were behind her young faces at a late hour, visible in the doorway light, watching the officers stand on their porch. The distress was visible, physical, present in her body in a way that Boyd's had not been. She asked what happened. She asked more than once. The daughters confirmed her account of the evening. She had been home. They had all been home. Grief looks a certain way. Boyd did not look that way. Investigators took that contrast seriously. A man who drove to a murder scene without being called, a woman whose daughters placed her at home. The shape of it pointed somewhere toward Boyd, toward whatever relationship existed between these three people, toward the oldest possible motive. But the theory ran out of ground quickly. There was no physical evidence placing Boyd at the scene during the shooting, nothing on his vehicle, nothing on his person. They needed something that anchored him to the moment, not just to the people. The affect was wrong, but wrong affect alone does not build a case. Cynthia did not wait to be asked. She told investigators she would take a polygraph. Whatever it takes, she said, schedule it. They did, 2 weeks out. The investigation had a direction now. Not a suspect. Not a certainty, but a direction. And Cynthia Phillips had just volunteered to walk straight into it. 2 weeks was the window. That was a long time to sit with the questions they were going to ask her. The polygraph was 2 weeks away. In Corsicana, 2 weeks was long enough for the town to form its own conclusions. Small towns do not wait for investigators. They have already decided. In the days after Toby's death, the talk started the way it always does, quietly, in clusters, across counters and parking lots and the spaces between church pews. People had seen things. They had noticed things. They had stored the impressions they collected, and now they were sharing them. And what they shared circled back to one name: Cynthia Phillips. The questions were not complex. They were the same questions that surface whenever something violent happens near a woman who was set to benefit. Why had she seemed so composed in some moments and so distressed in others? Who was the man who drove to the crime scene without being called? There was supposed to be a wedding. Now there was no wedding, no Toby, and no explanation that settled comfortably into place. None of this was evidence. Corsicana knew that. But a small town's suspicion is its own kind of record, and it was being kept. Then the phones started ringing in another direction. Investigators received calls from contacts in Colorado, people who had known Cynthia before she came to Texas. They named her ex-husband Ron Phillips. The picture they described was specific. Before she left Colorado, Cynthia had drained his bank accounts, not skimmed drained. She had taken what was there and moved on. The people calling were not angry on Ron's behalf. They were calling because they recognized the shape of something. A pattern, a woman who enters a life, extracts what it holds, and leaves before the weight of consequences arrives. Gossip is not evidence, but sometimes gossip is the only thing moving. The Colorado calls gave investigators a frame they had not had before. This was not a woman who had stumbled into a tragedy. This was a woman with a documented history of leaving men financially depleted. Whether that history connected to a crime scene on West Park Road was a different question, one that required more than phone calls to answer. The investigation had no physical evidence. No new witnesses had come forward. Rick Boyd's flat affect at the scene remained unexplained but unprovable. The love triangle theory still had no ground to stand on. What the case had was a date on the calendar and the name of a test. 1 week before the polygraph, a man named Billy Bear Slaughter picked up a phone. He was not a witness from the scene. He had not been there that night. But he had been carrying something. A conversation. A memory. A weight. And he had made a decision about what to do with it. What he told investigators would not wait for any scheduled appointment. It was the kind of information that changes the shape of a case from the moment it is spoken. Slaughter's call told investigators something they could not yet prove, but could no longer ignore. To understand what they were looking at, they had to go further back, past Corsicana, past Colorado, past everything Cynthia Phillips had become. They had to go back to 1982, to a high school in Edwards County, Kansas, and to a quiet, trusting man who would be the first person to learn what it cost to love her. Every pattern has a beginning. Cynthia Phillips's began with Les Conradi, her first husband, and the first man she would leave behind. Les was a young man in Edwards County, not a complicated person, not a suspicious one. He met Cynthia in high school, and he fell for her the way some people fall completely. Without a reservation, he couldn't talk himself out of. She was already pregnant when they met. Pregnant by another man, someone who was not going to marry her. Les knew. He had been told. Or he could see it plainly enough. And he married her anyway. Not because he was naive, because he had made a choice. His loyalty was something he handed over willingly and completely, and he expected nothing less in return. That expectation was the thing Cynthia would use against him. By the time their second anniversary passed, somewhere around 1984, she was already involved with another man. His name was Ron Phillips. It did not happen all at once. These things rarely do. There was probably a period when Les sensed something, without naming it, a shift in temperature, a late return. The silence where a conversation never started. He may have chosen not to press it. Some people love in a way that holds on even past the point where holding on is wise. Les Conradi's loyalty was not a weakness, but Cynthia Phillips treated it like one. The affair with Ron deepened while the marriage to Les continued in its outward form. Two things were true at once: a marriage that existed on paper and in the daily routines of a household, and a relationship that was already replacing it. Les absorbed the contradiction. He stayed. In 1986, Cynthia left. She went to Colorado with Ron Phillips and did not look back. Not entirely. She kept a thread. The daughter she had was still there, still connected to Les, and that connection gave her something useful, a reason for him to remain within reach. He accepted it because the alternative was losing the girls at greater distance. Les stayed in Edwards County, not for her, but to remain close to his daughters. He was the first man to be used and left behind by Cynthia Phillips. He would not be the last. The same pattern, the entry, the extraction, the controlled exit, had already formed before Cynthia ever crossed into Texas. What investigators in Corsicana were only beginning to map. Les Conradi had already lived through more than a decade before Toby Matthews was shot on West Park Road. Ron Phillips was not a complicated man. He worked, he built, and he believed that was enough. When he brought Cynthia to Haswell, Kiowa County, Colorado in 1986, he had a direction, something to put his hands to, a life he could construct from the ground up. And he did. By 1993, he had established L&M Processing, a slaughterhouse operation in Haswell that ran on the kind of labor that begins before dawn and ends after dark. The work was physical, demanding, relentless. The industrial noise of it filled the days, the equipment, the cold, the weight of everything the job required. Ron gave all of it. The slaughterhouse ran because he willed it to run. Early mornings, late evenings, the kind of work that marks a man's hands and fills the space where other thoughts might otherwise live. What he was building for the two of them. Cynthia was present, she was not absent, but the shape of her investment was different from his. 7 years of labor and a shared life, that was what Ron had put into Haswell. Then the house burned. In 1993, a fire destroyed their home. The $16,000 insurance payout followed. Money arriving after a loss can feel like a lifeline, something to rebuild with, something to hold. Ron probably saw it that way. That was how he thought. The check arrived, the account received it, and for a moment it looked like the worst thing had produced the most useful result. What followed the payout was not rebuilding, it was renegotiation. The money Cynthia's hands could reach began moving out of shared accounts, away from the business, out of the life Ron was still trying to hold together. The fights that followed were about finances. They did not resolve. They escalated and then became a fixture, two people in the same house, and only one of them still believing in what they had. Ron thought the fire was the worst thing that happened to him that year. It wasn't. The same mechanism that had ended the marriage to Les was operating again. A man who worked. A woman who extracted. The only difference was that Ron had more to lose, and so the extraction took longer. By the mid-1990s, the accounts were hollow. The business he had built with his hands was the only thing Cynthia had not yet touched, because it could not be deposited. The marriage continued in name, but everything that had been shared, the money, the plans, the idea of a future, had been moved beyond his reach. She did not end it with a fight. She ended it by leaving nothing worth staying for. The accounts were empty. The marriage was over in everything but form. And Cynthia was already looking east past Haswell, past Colorado, toward a man in Corsicana, Texas, who did not yet know she was coming. Before Cynthia left for Texas, she made one attempt to solve the Colorado problem another way. March 1995, Opal's Bar in Lamar, Colorado. The noise of the room voices, the clink of glasses, a television in the corner fell into a particular kind of quiet when she leaned toward Bear and began to speak. She said Ron beat her. She said she needed someone to make sure it never happened again. And then she said how much she was willing to pay for that certainty. $20,000. Ron's death staged as a slaughterhouse accident. $10,000 up front, $10,000 when it was done. She described the operation, the machinery, the ways a man could be lost in that kind of work. The way an accident there would look to the people who came to investigate it afterward. She had thought about this. The details she offered were not vague. They were specific. Bear took the $10,000. Then he went to Haswell and he watched. He followed Ron around Kiowa County for weeks, the slaughterhouse, the roads between, the ordinary patterns of a man's ordinary days. He was looking for what Cynthia had described: a violent man, a dangerous man, a man whose death could be framed as justice. What he found was a man who worked, who came home, who stopped at the same places, at the same intervals, the way a man does when he has nothing to hide, who moved through his days without the shadow of what Cynthia had put on him. No bruises on her when Bear saw her, no confrontations, no evidence that the marriage he was watching from the outside matched the one she had described from the inside. He had been watching Ron Phillips for weeks. Ron Phillips had never raised a hand. Bear was not certain. Uncertainty is not the same as refusal. He stayed. He kept watching. Then one day in April he saw something that settled it. Cynthia was standing near a door. She looked around, the particular look of someone checking whether they are seen. Then she swung the door deliberately into her own face. She stood for a moment. Then she pressed a hand to the injury and went inside to show it to whoever would look. Bear had seen her do it. He had watched her build the evidence from nothing. The story she had sold him, the violence, the danger, the reason this man needed to die was a performance she was maintaining with her own body as the prop. He did not act on the contract. He kept the $10,000, and he left Colorado. Ron Phillips never knew a man had been paid to watch him die. The plan had been priced, staged, and rehearsed, and it had failed. Not because Cynthia gave up, but because the man she hired looked too closely. Cynthia did not abandon a plan. She revised it. 3 years later, she would find someone who did not walk away. 3 years. That was how long it took for the revised plan to find its next target. August 22nd, 1996. Edwards County, Kansas. A phone rang at a bar, and someone called out for Les. He answered. The voice belonged to a woman, an unidentified woman, who asked for him by name and gave no name of her own. She told him enough to make him move, and Les left the bar without telling anyone where he was going. He did not come back. The people who had last seen him knew what they knew. A phone rang, a woman called, and he walked out the door. They did not see the direction he took. They did not hear what she said. The bar noise closed in behind him, and that was the last ordinary moment Les would ever have. Days passed. Then someone found him near Jewel Road Bridge in Edwards County. The water in that part of Kansas is flat and still, not the kind of landscape that takes a man by surprise. He was dead. The cause of death was drowning. How he had come to be in the water, who had last been with him, why he had left that bar to go to that place. None of it had an immediate answer. The investigation in Kansas started with the facts it had. A man left a bar after receiving a call from an unidentified woman. His body was found in the water days later. No witness had seen what happened at the bridge. The phone call was the last thread. The woman on the other end of it had no name, no documented identity, no way to be traced through the ordinary means available in 1996. Drowning can be an accident. But who writes a letter to tell you where to find the body weeks after Les was found? A letter arrived at the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. It was handwritten. It was not signed. What it contained was specific directions to where the body had been located, a location that had not yet been made public, a detail that should not have been known by anyone who was not present when it happened. The letter writer knew where Les was before anyone had officially reported finding him. The KBI submitted the letter for fingerprint analysis. Whatever hands had held that paper, whatever fingers had pressed against the envelope, had potentially left something behind. The letter was evidence the writer may not have known they were creating a physical trace sent directly to the agency that would most want to find them. On paper. In handwriting. In the particular pressure of a pen. Someone had reached out to investigators and told them more than they should have known. The letter had not been prompted by a news report. No report had named the location. Whoever wrote it had been there or been told by someone who was. The fingerprint analysis would take time, but the letter was already in hand. The KBI letter was still in the lab when Bear walked into the Kiowa Police Department in Elbert County, Colorado. He did not call ahead. He did not ask for a specific person. He sat down across from an investigator and said he knew who had killed Toby Matthews. He said he knew because he had been asked to do the same thing 3 years earlier. Bear's account was even and precise. He described the approach at Opal's bar in Lamar in March 1995. He named Cynthia. He described the offer she made, the staging, the amount, the upfront payment with the accuracy of a man who had turned it over in his memory many times since then. He had not agreed in the way she hoped. He had taken the money. He had watched. And he had seen her manufacture the evidence she needed to justify her own request. He did not speak with uncertainty. He did not hedge. Every detail he gave was specific, sequential, and internally consistent. The $10,000 was real. The bar in Lamar was real. What he had witnessed in Haswell was real. The account did not waver under questioning. Investigators were not listening to a man trying to construct a story. They were listening to a man trying to unburden himself of one he had been carrying for 3 years. When he heard that Toby was dead, he told them he had not been surprised. He had recognized it. Bear told them what recognition felt like in this case. He had been the man she approached the first time. She had laid out a method, a target, a price. Someone else had agreed to carry it through to completion. That was the only difference between what happened to Toby and what he had walked away from in 1995. The plan was the same. The woman behind it was the same. He was not guessing. He had seen the blueprint. Investigators took Bear's statement and moved to the next step quietly, without alerting anyone in Corsicana. They requested her insurance records. What was in those records did not look like a grieving fiancé's paperwork. There was a life insurance policy on Toby. The beneficiary was listed as Cynthia. The policy was recent, taken out not long before the night on West Park Road when 7 shots ended his life. The numbers on those pages were not grief. They were a motive on paper, signed and dated, sitting in a file that Cynthia had not expected anyone to pull. Bear had given them the testimony. The insurance records gave it structure. Together, they were the beginning of a case one built not on suspicion or small-town talk, but on a man who had been there, and a document that proved why. $100,000. That was the policy amount. And Cynthia had called the insurance agent to file a claim within 1 week of Toby's death. The call was documented. The date was confirmed. Investigators looked at that record and understood what they were seeing. Grief produces certain behaviors, funeral arrangements, calls to family, the slow paralysis of loss. It does not, as a rule, produce an insurance claim filed before a man is buried. The timing was not the behavior of shock. It was the behavior of someone who knew the money was coming and did not want to wait. The policy was worth $100,000. The beneficiary was Cynthia. She had taken it out not long before the shooting on West Park Road, and within days of Toby's death, she was already on the phone with the agent, moving toward collection. That call would not have looked suspicious in isolation. People do file claims quickly. There are bills, there are arrangements, there is a practical dimension to loss that runs alongside the grief. But investigators were not looking at that call in isolation anymore. They were looking at it alongside Bear's account of the 1995 offer and alongside the money she had paid up front for a murder that was never completed. It fit a pattern that had already taken shape across 2 states before it arrived in Texas. Then the Kansas records came through. The cross-reference pulled Les's 1996 drowning in Edwards County, the bar, the unidentified phone call, the body at the bridge, the anonymous letter sent to the KBI after his death, the letter that knew where to find him before the location was public. All of it now sat in the same file as the insurance claim on Toby. She had done this before, not once, twice, 2 dead men, 2 states, a third man, Ron, who had been financially stripped and left behind in Colorado. And in every case, at every critical turning point, the same name appeared. Not as a bystander, not as an unlucky partner, as the architect. Les in Kansas, Ron in Colorado, approached for murder, drained of savings, discarded. Boy in Texas shot 7 times, policy filed within a week. 3 men across 3 states, and 1 woman whose name investigators kept finding at the center of each destruction. The investigators were no longer building a theory. They were documenting a career that stretched back to at least 1995, possibly to 1996, and had reached its latest and most lethal expression on a side road in Corsicana. The polygraph Cynthia had offered was now 3 days away. She had proposed it herself, in the first days after Toby's death, as a gesture of cooperation. She did not yet know what was in the file that would be sitting across the table from her when she arrived. She had 3 days after the investigators built their file. 3 days while they documented what they had found. The policy record, the Colorado account, and she sat in Corsicana, unaware of how much paper had accumulated in her name. On April 28, 1998, Cynthia walked into the examination room in Corsicana and sat down. She had offered this test herself. She had scheduled it, confirmed it, and arrived for it composed. The room held the standard arrangement, a chair, equipment, a procedural quiet that settles before these things begin. Whatever she brought into that room, her version of events, her rehearsed responses, her certainty that she could hold herself still, she had refined it over 14 days. She sat very still. The wires attached. The machine began its baseline. She looked like a woman cooperating. She had looked that way from the beginning, the visible grief at the door. The daughters as witnesses, the polygraph offered unprompted as proof of nothing to hide. Every gesture had pointed in the same direction. Investigators noted it all. So did the examiner. Before we hear what those questions produced, if this case is staying with you, drop a comment with a number from 1 to 10 for how calculated this looks. And one word that explains it. A quick note, the next section includes reconstructed examination details for narrative purposes. The events and outcome are documented. The polygraph examiner, a procedural presence, unnamed in the record, moved through the examination in sequence, baseline questions first, orienting questions, then the relevant ones. The examiner's voice was flat and procedural. Did you shoot Toby Matthews? The room held the question. Did you conspire to have him killed? She answered. Did you arrange his death? She answered again. Cynthia answered every question. The examination continued in its documented sequence. Outside, investigators waited. They had been waiting since before she arrived. The chair, the wires. A woman who had made herself the main witness for her own defense, offering her body to a machine that could not be charmed. She had 2 weeks to prepare. What exactly had she been preparing for? The results came back wrong. Not on one question, on all of them. Every relevant answer she gave registered as deceptive. The examination she had volunteered for, scheduled herself, and sat through with composure had produced the opposite of what she came to demonstrate. The machine did not say she was cooperative. It said she was lying. She had walked into this room of her own choosing. The cooperation was deliberate. The confidence was real. And neither one had protected her from a machine that measures the gap between what a person says and what their body already knows. The results were on the table. The machine had said what it said. Outside the examination room, investigators from 3 states had been coordinating, and now they had one more document to add to the file. Cynthia was about to step out into a different investigation than the one she had entered. The polygraph results were on the table when they came back in. 3 states, 1 file, and a machine that had already returned its verdict. They told her what they had. Cynthia Phillips did what she had always done. She pointed at someone else. Her account was controlled. She had not known, she said, what Rick Boyd intended to do. She had trusted him. Whatever had happened to Toby that night, that was Rick, not her. The statement came out structured and composed. The performance of a woman wrongly implicated by a man she had let too close. She named him without hesitation. She offered Rick Boyd the way you offer a receipt cleanly, as proof of a transaction already settled. Investigators had heard this kind of arrangement before, the grief visible from the start. The polygraph offered before it was requested. Now the redirect, a co-conspirator named before they had finished the question. Each move had arrived in sequence. The speed of the deflection was its own kind of data. Rick Boyd was in a separate room. He did not deflect. He talked. His account was specific, sequential, and complete. The detail that comes from someone who has been carrying a weight too long and has finally decided to set it down. The cold medicine errand was not an errand. It was the mechanism. Cynthia had told Toby to go get cold medicine. That was the ruse, something small, something routine, something that would put him in a car on a road at a time already arranged. He drove toward West Park Road, not knowing what was waiting. Boyd walked them through the sequence. Cynthia had fired first. He had delivered the killing shot to Toby's right temple. 2 shooters, 1 dead man in the field, 1 $100,000 policy with her name on it. Rick Boyd told them everything, and Cynthia Phillips was still not under arrest. The confession was precise and irreversible. It identified her as the shooter who moved first, placed her at the scene, and documented a coordinated killing built around an errand. It connected to the failed polygraph from earlier that same day, to the drained Colorado accounts, and to the Kansas files still accumulating in another state. By the close of April 28, 1998, investigators had Boyd's confession, a pattern across 3 states, and a clear architecture with her name at every point. Rick Boyd was placed in handcuffs. First-degree murder. The confession that put him there had named her too. Cynthia Phillips walked out. Texas law did not permit her arrest on the evidence as structured Boyd's statement naming her, without the corroborating documentation the statute required. She had fired first. The man who said so was in a cell. She stepped through the building's exit into the April afternoon, identified as the architect of a planned killing, and she was free. The law had drawn a line that day. It had drawn it in the wrong place. She walked out free, and the investigators who watched her go had no legal instrument to stop it. Texas had Boyd's confession. Texas had the polygraph. Texas had the insurance policy, the Colorado accounts, the Kansas drowning. What Texas did not have was a path to a charge. The statute was plain. In Texas, no one can be convicted of a felony based solely on the testimony of an accomplice. Rick Boyd was the only witness to the events of that night. He was an accomplice. His confession, every detail he had given, the ruse, the road, the sequence of shots, was accomplice testimony. Without independent corroborating evidence sufficient to connect Cynthia Phillips to the crime, Texas law would not permit a charge. The confession that named her was also the thing that shielded her. The law designed to protect defendants from false accusations by co-conspirators was now protecting the one who had pulled the trigger first. Investigators had the document. They had read it. They understood what it said. Understanding it did not change it. The same rule that kept innocent people from being imprisoned on a liar's word was the rule that put the forms back in the drawer. The Colorado file had been building in parallel. What Bear had walked into Kiowa PD with in April 1998, his account of Opal's bar in Lamar, the $20,000 offer, the $10,000 he had pocketed and walked away with, had moved from a tip to a formal record. Colorado had a witness. Colorado had an offer, a payment, and a named target who had survived. Colorado did not have Texas's accomplice corroboration requirement standing between its prosecutors and a charge. Colorado charged Cynthia Phillips with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The intended victim was Ron Phillips. The year was 1995, 3 years before Toby died. A field in Navarro County and a confession from Rick Boyd sat in Texas unchargeable. What Colorado had was a bar, a witness, and a plan that had never reached its conclusion. She was being arrested for the crime she didn't finish, not the one she did. They came for her in Corsicana, Colorado authorities. She was crying when they placed her in custody. The tears were visible, audible, the same register she had used at the door in April, the same performance of a woman broken by circumstances that kept finding her. Investigators who were present watched. They had watched her cry before. These tears did not match the moment. They said not grief at something lost, not shock at something unexpected, something else. Something that started the second it became useful. She was taken into custody and transported. Toby Matthews' murder remained without a charge in the state where it happened. Rick Boyd sat in a Texas cell. The insurance policy sat frozen. The Kansas file sat open, and Cynthia Phillips in handcuffs was crying for Colorado on a conspiracy count for a man who was still alive. The Colorado charge put her in a county jail cell. That cell had a roommate. Manda Packard was 23 years old and had been placed there the same way anyone gets placed in a shared cell, by circumstance, by overcrowding, by the ordinary administration of a holding facility. She did not choose the arrangement. Neither did Cynthia. That part would matter later. They began the way strangers in close quarters sometimes do. Cynthia spoke about her daughters first, where they were, how they were managing without her. The particular ache of a mother separated from her children by a situation of her own making. Manda had children too, she said so. The conversation found its footing on that shared ground, two women who missed their kids. Talking in the way that proximity and shared deprivation manufacture warmth out of almost nothing. It felt ordinary. Manda would remember that it felt ordinary and that it stopped feeling that way so quickly. The cell was small, a few feet between the bunks. Cynthia's voice was even, not lowered, not careful, not the voice of someone managing what they were saying. She talked the way she might have talked about a trip she had taken, a problem she had solved.
It was a great dad. The girls did anything that they needed, they got.
Situation that had required planning and had, in the end, worked out. She described the cold medicine errand, the road, what had been arranged before Toby arrived. She described what she and Rick Boyd had done when he got there. She wasn't confessing. She was just talking. Manda went still. This is what witnesses sometimes describe in moments like this, not fear exactly, not yet, but a kind of recalibration. The conversation that had felt like one thing was suddenly something else entirely. She was not a detective. She had no training for what to do with what she was hearing. She sat on a bunk in a locked cell, and the woman across from her was describing a killing with the same cadence she had used to describe her daughters even, untroubled, as though the weight of it had left her entirely. Cynthia did not appear to register the shift. She kept talking. The tone did not change. There was no lowering of the voice at the difficult parts, no hesitation before the specific details. The mechanics came out the same way the rest had, like information being shared between two people with no reason to guard it. Like a plan she had run efficiently and moved past. Manda could not move past it. She was locked in. The door was the same door it had been 10 minutes ago. But the room was different now. She was sitting 3 feet from a woman who had described, without being asked, without being pressed, without any apparent awareness that it mattered, exactly how Toby Matthews had died. The cell had not changed size. It felt smaller. She had the information. She had nowhere to take it, not yet. She had been deciding since the moment Cynthia stopped talking. It took Manda Packard until April 29, 1999 to find the phone, not because she was unsure, but because she was still inside the system that held them both. And the path out ran through a call she had been building toward since that day in the cell. She asked to speak to investigators about Cynthia Phillips. When they connected her, she talked. Her account was specific. The errand described as a ruse, the road, the sequence of events Cynthia had delivered in the same voice she used to talk about her daughters. Manda did not speculate. She reported what she had heard, in the order she had heard it. The details matched what Rick Boyd had told investigators a year earlier, the cold medicine. West Park Road, the arrangement made before Toby arrived, but Manda had no access to Boyd's account. She was not reciting someone else's version. She had been sitting 3 feet away when Cynthia described it, and she had remembered. Investigators noted all of it. Then they gave her a polygraph. She passed. The same instrument that had returned deceptive results on every relevant question Cynthia answered was now telling investigators the opposite about Manda Packard. Her account was verified. Her account was also something Boyd's could never be, testimony from a witness who played no role in the crime. Texas law barred conviction on accomplice testimony alone. Manda was not an accomplice. She was a cellmate who listened and did not forget. Rick Boyd's confession wasn't enough. Manda Packard's phone call was. The Texas corroboration requirement had stood for over a year as the wall between investigators and a murder charge. It still stood, but it now had a door in it. Manda's testimony corroborated the mechanics Boyd had confessed to. This Boyd had confessed to an unimpeachable source, through a channel the statute had no answer for. The prosecutors had what they had been waiting for since April 28, 1998. On July 22, 1999, a Texas grand jury indicted Cynthia Phillips for the first-degree murder of Toby Matthews. The charge that had been legally unreachable, blocked first by a statute, then by the absence of a witness who was not an accomplice, was now a formal document. It bore her name, the victim's name, the date of the killing. It was the product of a phone call from a Colorado jail, made almost a year after Cynthia had described a killing to the wrong person in the right cell. More than a year between the shooting and the charge that finally matched it. A year of legal dead ends, barriers on paper, and a confession that sat in a Texas file without sufficient support to move on until a cellmate made a decision and picked up the phone. Cynthia Phillips was now indicted for murder in Texas. She was already in custody in Colorado. 2 states, 2 charges, 1 trial still ahead. 2 states had her name on active documents. A 3rd state had a question it could not answer. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation had never closed Les Conradi's file. His body had been pulled from the water near Jewel Road Bridge in Edwards County in August 1996, and the case had moved forward the way drowning cases sometimes do in rural counties, without obvious foul play, without a named suspect, and without the kind of evidence that turns a death into a charge. What the file contained that most drowning cases did not was the letter. The anonymous handwritten note sent to KBI after his body was found had directed investigators to the location before they would have found it on their own. The letter knew where he was. No one had ever explained how. With Cynthia Phillips indicted in Texas, the KBI brought the letter out again. It went under examination. Fingerprint analysis was conducted. The question the letter had always carried, who had the information to write it, was now being asked in a different context, with a different weight behind it. The bridge had not been a guess. The note's specificity was confirmed against the recovery record. The location named in the letter matched where the body had been found, with a precision that eliminated accident. A stranger does not describe a bridge in Edwards County at exactly the right point along exactly the right stretch of water. Someone who knew about a body might. The letter knew exactly where to look. How do you write a letter like that without knowing what you did? Investigators formed a theory. It centered on timing. Les Conradi's body had needed to be found within a specific window, long enough after his death for the cause to appear natural, quickly enough to initiate a death benefits claim. The anonymous letter sent to the state agency most likely to respond had accomplished exactly that. Someone had written it knowing the location. Someone had sent it knowing what would follow. The theory pointed in a direction that required no imagination to trace. The fingerprint analysis came back. The physical evidence in the file was reviewed. What investigators had was a theory with a coherent mechanism, a letter with suspicious specificity, and a pattern that connected 3 states and 3 dead or nearly dead men in one woman's orbit. What they did not have was the threshold a charge required. No confession, no physical evidence sufficient to place her at the water or on the bridge. A letter is not a signed admission. A pattern is not a conviction. Without that, the case could not move forward. Les Conradi's file remained open in Edwards County. It would stay open. The KBI had a theory and a letter and a dead man who had married the wrong person in 1982. None of it was enough. The case would not be formally charged. It would simply remain a 3rd name, a 3rd state, a file that would never close. The Kansas file would stay open. The Texas courtroom would not wait. October 2000, 2 years after the 7 casings on West Park Road. Cynthia Phillips took her seat at the defense table in Corsicana. The state had 3 things: a convicted accomplice who confessed, a cellmate who listened, and a pattern that reached across state lines. The defense had one priority: take apart the first of those before the jury could weigh the other 2. Rick Boyd was the obvious target. He was a convicted co-conspirator testifying under terms that served him. His statements across multiple interviews had not been perfectly consistent. They never are in cases like this, where someone has talked more than once over more than a year. The defense worked the inconsistencies methodically. Every contradiction was marked. Every benefit Boyd had received was put in front of the jury. By the time cross-examination was done, he was a man who had his own reasons for saying what he said, and the jury knew it. The prosecution's answer was Manda Packard. She took the stand without the problems that followed Boyd everywhere he went. She was not an accomplice. She had received no benefit for her testimony. The defense could question her credibility, could suggest she had misheard or misremembered, but it could not say she had anything gain. Manda described what Cynthia had told her in the cell. The errand, the location, the details of how Toby had died, the details no one had given her. The defense had no mechanism to explain where those details came from. The testimony held. She did not look like a woman on trial. She looked like a woman waiting for something she had already accounted for. An investigator took the stand. He described the moment Cynthia Phillips looked at him across the courtroom. She had done it more than once during the proceedings, holding the look without shifting, without the adjustment a person makes when they realize they are being seen. He was asked to describe what he saw. "She looked at me," he said, "and there was nothing there." The courtroom held that sentence. The jury was watching her as he said it. She did not look away. The closing arguments were made. The jury was assembled and sent to deliberate. The courtroom settled into the specific suspension of a room waiting for a verdict, the lawyers at their tables, the defendant in her seat, the gallery quiet. The deliberations ran their course. The jury was called back in. They took their seats. And then the prosecutor rose, not to present evidence, not to address the judge on a procedural matter. The prosecutor rose and interrupted the proceedings at the exact moment the verdict was about to be read aloud. Something had changed between the time the jury went to deliberate and the moment it returned. Something had entered the case from outside the courtroom, and the trial was not going to end the way anyone in that room expected. The prosecutor had risen to tell the courtroom that Cynthia Phillips had changed her mind, not about guilt or innocence, about who would say it first. The jury had reached a verdict. It was waiting in an envelope in the jury room. She had decided she would not let them deliver it. The guilty plea was entered in October 2000 in Corsicana, Navarro County, Texas, for the murder of Toby Matthews. The courtroom that had assembled for a verdict received an admission instead. The jurors who had sat through Boyd's cross-examination, through Manda Packett's testimony, through the investigator's words about eyes that carried nothing, they were dismissed without reading what they had written down. Their verdict would not become part of the record. Hers would. She had made the decision for them. The mechanism had worked exactly as it was designed to work. She had given the prosecution what it needed just before the jury could take it from her. It was, in its way, consistent. Every prior move had been about timing when to produce grief, when to offer the polygraph, when to name Rick Boyd. This one was no different. The admission came at the last moment available. Colorado had already moved. Cynthia Phillips was convicted in that state of conspiring to commit first-degree murder for the 1995 plot against Ron Phillips, the plan that Bear had described. The offer made at Opal's bar. The money already paid. Bear's testimony had held on the stand, the same way Manda's had held in Texas. It came from a direct witness. It was specific, and the defense could not explain it away. The two convictions ran across 2 states. One for a murder completed in a field off West Park Road, one for a murder that never happened because the man hired to do it had kept the money and left. 2 convictions, 1 open case. And somewhere in Kansas, a file that would never be closed. The Texas Department of Corrections Women's Facility received her. She was transported and processed a name in a system, a sentence to serve, a record that would not change. The world she had operated.
She approached me because she heard from people that I would kill somebody for money. She wanted to look like an accident, but she wanted him to hurt before he went.
There were no more rooms to arrange, no more versions to rehearse, no more men to move into position. She was in. Les Conradi's drowning in Edwards County was never charged. His name appeared on no conviction. The anonymous letter sat in a KBI file without producing a case that could reach a courtroom. 3 men had intersected with Cynthia Phillips across 3 states and across 2 decades, 1 dead in Texas, 1 dead in Kansas, 1 alive in Colorado because the plan had not been completed. 2 of those 3 had produced convictions. The 3rd had produced a file. She was in prison. Nothing that had been done was undone. She maintains her innocence from inside a Texas women's facility, which is where maintaining your innocence gets you when you entered the guilty plea yourself. The conviction is on record. The facility is real. The innocence is the one thing she will not let go. Toby Matthews was 29 years old and planning a wedding. He had moved from Lamar to Corsicana for a woman he loved, not for work, not for family, not for any practical reason that does not reduce to the simplest one. He had taken on 2 girls who were not his daughters and raised them without making it a point to be noticed for it. On the night of April 14, 1998, a child was sick. He was asked to go get cold medicine. He said yes. Because that is what he did. He went when he was asked. He helped when there was something to do. He drove to the store on an ordinary Texas night, the same way anyone does when someone they love asks them to. He did not come back. The road he drove down, the field where he stopped, the 7 casings on West Park Road. None of that was the end of him as a person. It was the end of him in the record. A man who moved for love, who stepped into a family without being required to, who drove to get cold medicine on the last night of his life because a child had a cold and he was the one who was asked. Les Conradi picked up a phone in a Kansas bar on August 22, 1996, and walked out. The woman who called was never traced to a name. The case was never charged. The file stays open. He answered the phone and walked out the door. And the record ends there. Not with a verdict, not with a charge, just with a man who left and did not return. She trusted the cold medicine to look like an errand. She trusted the night to look like a robbery. She trusted the people who knew her to stay quiet. She was wrong about all of it. Bear held the secret for 3 years before he walked into Kiowa PD. Rick kept it for 14 days before he sat down across from investigators and told them everything. Manda Packard was a stranger in a...
Rick's demeanor was not that of someone who suddenly rolled up and found out that his friend was deceased. A normal reaction would be immediate signs of grief. He was fairly flat.
Who had no reason to know anything, and Cynthia gave her everything anyway. Each person who was supposed to stay quiet found their own moment to speak. The cold medicine was for a sick child. Toby Matthews drove out because someone he loved asked him to go. He drove past the last ordinary moment of his life without knowing it was the last one. West Park Road is still there. The 7 casings have been logged and catalogued for more than 25 years. And one by one, the people she trusted to keep her secret were the ones who spoke it. Toby Matthews was 29 years old. He went when he was asked, and he did not come back. Cases like this one leave something behind that a verdict cannot fully settle. A man who moved for love, who stepped into a family without being required to, who drove out on an ordinary Texas night. He deserves to be remembered as more than evidence in a case file. What this story shows is that silence...
She bragged like it was nothing, like baking a cake or winning $20 on the lottery. She thought
3 years. Rick held it for 2 weeks. Manda Packard was a stranger who held it for a single afternoon. One by one they spoke. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. What part of it will you carry with you? Subscribe so you do not miss the next story. And if you know someone who should hear this, share it with them. This story is based on real events. Some scenes have been dramatized to help tell it clearly. Our thoughts remain with Toby Matthews, his family, and everyone affected by what happened on West Park Road. Thank you for listening.